Welcome to Sleep Stories in Rain, where whispers from beyond the veil become chilling reality. Tonight, we dive into disturbing true Ouija horror stories, tales where innocent curiosity calls forth nightmares and the thin boundary between worlds shatters. Only 50% of viewers are subscribed, so please hit that button to help us conjure more terrifying tales. Share your own Ouija experiences in the comments. Did you ever hear answers you wish you hadn't, or sense something evil slip through? Your stories fuel our hauntings. If you seek real accounts of supernatural terror and forbidden contact, you're in the right place. Let's begin our first story. I should have known better than to touch that board again. 3 weeks have passed since I last held a planchette, but my hands still shake when I think about what happened in my grandmother's attic that October night. The memory haunts me every time I close my eyes, replaying like a broken record that refuses to stop. It started when my cousin Jake found the old Ouija board tucked behind dusty Christmas decorations. The wooden surface looked ancient, with letters so worn they were barely visible in the dim light. Jake grinned as he pulled it out, his dark eyes gleaming with mischief. "Come on, Alex," he said. "What's the worst that could happen?" I wish I had walked away right then. We set up the board on my grandmother's old oak table, the same one where she used to read tarot cards for the neighborhood ladies. The attic felt colder than usual, and shadows danced in the corners where our flashlight couldn't reach. My girlfriend Sarah sat across from me, her blonde hair catching the light as she nervously tucked it behind her ears. "This is stupid," she whispered, but her fingers found the planchette anyway. At first, nothing happened. We asked the usual questions, half joking, half serious. Then the planchette began to move, slowly at first, then with more confidence. The board spelled out "hello," and we all looked at each other with nervous laughter. "Who are you?" Jake asked, trying to sound brave. The planchette jerked violently across the board. The message made my blood run cold. "I am the one who waits." Sarah tried to pull her hands away, but the planchette seemed to stick to her fingers. "I can't let go," she gasped, panic rising in her voice. The board continued spelling out messages faster now, each one more disturbing than the last. "You opened the door. I have been waiting so long. Now I can come through." The temperature in the attic plummeted. Our breath began forming clouds, and frost started appearing on the old window glass. The single bulb hanging above us flickered and dimmed, casting twisted shadows that seemed to move independently of our bodies. That's when we heard the scratching. It started soft, like mice in the walls, but grew louder and more insistent. The sound came from everywhere at once, the floorboards, the ceiling, inside the walls themselves. Sarah finally managed to tear her hands away from the planchette, but it continued moving on its own, spelling out words that made no sense but filled us with dread. "The door is open. I am here. Look behind you." We spun around in unison, and what I saw will haunt me until the day I die. A shadow stood in the corner, but it wasn't cast by anything in the room. It had substance, depth, and worst of all, it had eyes, 2 pinpricks of light that seemed to burn with ancient hunger. The shadow began to move toward us, growing larger with each step. The scratching sound intensified, and now I could tell it was coming from inside the shadow itself, as if thousands of claws were scraping against the inside of reality, trying to tear their way through. Jake grabbed the board and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the far wall, but the shadow kept coming. The broken pieces of the board began to glow with a sickly green light, and I could hear whispers in a language that predated human speech. Sarah screamed. The sound snapped me out of my paralysis, and I grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the attic stairs. Jake was right behind us as we stumbled down into the hallway below. The shadow didn't follow it, couldn't leave the attic, but I could feel its presence pressing against the ceiling above us, testing the boundaries of whatever held it there. We ran from the house that night and didn't look back. The next morning, I called my grandmother to warn her, but she just laughed. "That old thing's been up there for 60 years, she said. "My mother warned me never to touch it. Some doors should stay closed." 3 weeks later, my grandmother died in her sleep. The official cause was heart failure, but I know better. When I went to help clean out her house, I couldn't bring myself to go back into the attic. The real estate agent mentioned that the temperature up there seemed unusually cold, and there were strange scratch marks on the walls that hadn't been there before. The house sold quickly to a young family with 2 small children. I wanted to warn them, but who would believe such a story? Instead, I lie awake at night, wondering if those children will find the broken pieces of that cursed board. Wondering if they'll try to put it back together. Because I know now that some things, once awakened, never truly go back to sleep. They just wait for the next curious soul to open the door and invite them in. The Ouija board sits in my closet now, wrapped in black cloth and buried under old sweaters, but I still hear it calling to me sometimes in the dead of night. What happened 3 months ago changed everything I thought I knew about death, and I'm telling you this story because I need someone else to know the truth before it's too late. It started as a stupid dare at my friend Jake's house. His older sister had left for college and forgotten her Ouija board in the basement. We were 17 and thought we were invincible, the kind of kids who'd sneak out to graveyards just to prove we weren't scared. That night, it was me, Jake, his girlfriend Mia, and my best friend Connor huddled around the wooden board by candlelight. The first few questions were harmless enough. We asked if anyone was there, and the planchette slowly moved to yes. Jake was obviously pushing it, so we all laughed and called him out. But then we asked for a name, and something changed. The temperature in the room dropped so fast I could see my breath, and the planchette began moving with a force that made all our fingers shake. The board spelled out Thomas Wright. None of us were moving it anymore. I could feel the thing pulling our hands along, letter by letter, with a determination that made my stomach turn. Connor tried to lift his hands away, but they stayed glued to the planchette like it was magnetized. "How did you die?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. The response came quickly. "Murdered in this house, 1987. Jake went pale. His family had bought the house in 1995, but he'd never heard about any murder. We should have stopped there, but teenagers are idiots, and we kept asking questions. The entity told us he was killed in the basement where we sat, that his body was hidden behind the old furnace, and that he'd been waiting 36 years for someone to find him. Then it started asking us questions. "Which one of you will help me?" appeared on the board. We all looked at each other nervously. None of us answered, but the planchette moved anyway. The boy with the scar. Connor had a thin white scar running from his left ear to his jaw from a childhood accident. He started shaking his head frantically, trying again to pull away from the board, but his hands wouldn't budge. "I want to stop," he said, panic creeping into his voice. "This isn't funny anymore." But the board wasn't done. "Bring me to the light. Dig behind the furnace. Set me free." Suddenly, every candle in the room blew out at once. In the darkness, we heard footsteps above us, slow and deliberate, moving across the living room floor. But Jake's parents were out of town, and we were alone in the house. We finally managed to break away from the board and scrambled upstairs, using our phones as flashlights. The living room was empty, but wet footprints led from the basement door to the front entrance, even though it hadn't rained in days. That night, Connor started having dreams about Thomas Wright. He'd wake up with dirt under his fingernails and no memory of how it got there. By the second week, he was sleepwalking to Jake's house, standing in the backyard with a shovel he'd taken from his garage. We tried to ignore it, told ourselves it was just stress or guilt playing tricks on his mind. But then Connor found the newspaper articles online. Thomas Wright, age 23, had indeed been reported missing in October 1987. His car was found abandoned, but his body never turned up. The last place he'd been seen alive was the house where Jake lived. The dreams got worse. Connor started showing up to school with cuts on his hands and arms, claiming he didn't remember how he got them. His parents took him to doctors, but no one could explain what was happening. He begged us to go back to the basement, to dig where the board had told us, just to make it stop. We refused at first, but watching our friend waste away was torture. Connor lost 20 pounds in a month. His eyes were hollow, surrounded by dark circles, and he'd flinch whenever anyone said the name Thomas. Finally, we couldn't take it anymore. Last week, we went back to Jake's basement with shovels and a flashlight. Behind the old furnace, exactly where the Ouija board had indicated, we found a canvas tarp wrapped around human remains. The bones were old and yellow, and there was still a wallet in the back pocket of the rotted jeans. The ID belonged to Thomas Wright. We called the police anonymously and left the scene. The next morning, the local news reported that the 36-year-old cold case had finally been solved. Thomas Wright's family could finally have closure and give him a proper burial. Connor's symptoms stopped immediately. The nightmares ended, the sleepwalking ceased, and he started gaining weight back. But something else began happening to me. I started hearing whispers in empty rooms, and shadows moved in my peripheral vision. Last night, I found a Ouija board on my bed that I'd never seen before. And this morning, there was a message spelled out in the condensation on my bathroom mirror. Thank you. Now it's your turn to help. I should have thrown that board away the moment I found it in my grandmother's attic, but something about its aged wood and faded letters drew me in like a moth to flame. The Ouija board had belonged to my great-aunt Sarah, who died under mysterious circumstances in 1987. And now here I was, 20 years old and desperate enough to try talking to the dead. My girlfriend Maya had just broken up with me. My dad was dying of cancer, and I felt like my whole world was crumbling around me. I figured, what harm could it do to ask for some guidance from beyond? The first time I used it alone in my dorm room, nothing happened. My fingers barely touched the planchette as I asked simple questions, but it just sat there like a piece of junk. I was about to give up when my roommate Jake walked in, laughing at me for being so desperate. But when I convinced him to try it with me, everything changed. The moment both our hands touched that heart-shaped pointer, it began to move with a life of its own. The board spelled out, "Hello, Thomas," before either of us had even asked a question. My blood ran cold because I had never told Jake that Thomas was my middle name. Jake's face went white as the planchette continued moving, spelling out, "I have been waiting." When we asked who was speaking to us, the response chilled us to the bone. Sarah, my great-aunt's name, the same woman whose board we were using. Over the next few weeks, Jake and I became obsessed with our nightly sessions. Sarah seemed friendly at first, giving us advice about school and relationships. She told us things about my family that I had never heard before, details that I later confirmed with my grandmother. But slowly, her messages became darker and more demanding. She wanted us to do things for her, small things at first, like lighting candles or leaving food out overnight. When we hesitated, the board would spell out angry threats about what would happen if we disobeyed. Then Sarah started asking us to hurt people. She gave us detailed instructions about classmates she wanted us to punish for imagined slights. The board spelled out, "Break his arm," when I mentioned a guy who had been rude to me in class. When we refused, the temperature in our room dropped so fast we could see our breath, and books started flying off our shelves. Jake wanted to quit, but every time we tried to put the board away, terrible things would happen. His laptop crashed and lost all his files. My car windows shattered overnight. We found dead birds arranged in perfect circles around our dorm building. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday night in November. We had been trying to ignore the board for 3 days, but the supernatural attacks were getting worse. Our room was freezing cold despite the heater running full blast, and we could hear scratching sounds inside the walls that kept us awake all night. When we finally gave in and used the board again, Sarah's message was different than usual. Instead of her typical demands, she spelled out something that made my heart stop. "I am not Sarah." When we frantically asked who had been talking to us all these weeks, the planchette moved with violent, jerky motions to spell out the one who killed her. The entity explained with sick pleasure how it had been trapped in the board since murdering my great-aunt in 1987, feeding off the energy of anyone foolish enough to use it. It had been growing stronger with each session, using our life force to build power in the physical world. The dead birds, the broken windows, the supernatural attacks, those were just the beginning of what it could do now that it had enough strength. Jake tried to rip his hands away from the planchette, but they seemed glued to the surface. The board spelled out its final message as we watched in horror. Tonight, you join Sarah. The lights in our room began flickering wildly, and a shadow darker than anything I had ever seen started rising from the board itself. I could hear my great-aunt's voice screaming my name from somewhere far away, warning me to run before it was too late. I managed to break free and grabbed a baseball bat, smashing that cursed board into splinters while Jake collapsed unconscious on the floor. The moment the wood shattered, the shadow let out an inhuman shriek and vanished, taking with it the oppressive cold that had been suffocating us. Jake woke up with no memory of the past month, and I never told him what really happened. I burned every piece of that board and scattered the ashes in running water, just like my grandmother taught me. That was 5 years ago, and I still wake up some nights hearing scratching sounds in my walls. I have never touched another Ouija board since, and I never will. Some doors should never be opened, because you never know what might be waiting on the other side, hungry for a way into our world. I still can't touch a Ouija board without my hands shaking. What happened in my basement 3 years ago changed everything I believed about the world. I was 22 then, home from college for winter break, staying in my childhood bedroom while my parents were visiting relatives in Florida. The house felt too quiet, too empty, so when I found the old Parker Brothers Ouija board in a dusty corner of the basement, I thought it might be fun to mess around with it. I'd always been skeptical of that stuff, but I was bored and curious. I set it up on the coffee table in the living room, lit a few candles for atmosphere, and placed my fingertips on the plastic planchette. At first, nothing happened. I asked simple questions like, "Is anyone there?" and "What's your name?" The planchette sat motionless under my fingers. I was starting to feel foolish when it suddenly jerked toward yes with such force that my hands flew off. My heart hammered as I placed my fingers back on the planchette. The board spelled out Marcus when I asked for a name. Then it spelled "died here" before I could ask another question. The house had been built in the 1940s, so it was possible someone had died here over the decades. I kept going, asking Marcus how he died. The planchette moved slowly to spell murder. A chill ran down my spine, but I pressed on. "Who murdered you?" I whispered. The response came quickly. "Father." I was fully invested now, my skepticism fading as the planchette moved with increasing confidence. Marcus told me he was 8 years old when his father killed him in 1952. He said his body was buried in the basement. I asked him to prove he was real, to give me some sign. That's when the candles started flickering in unison, and the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Then Marcus spelled out something that made my blood freeze. "He's still here." Before I could ask what he meant, the planchette shot across the board to spell "behind you." I spun around but saw nothing except shadows dancing in the candlelight. When I turned back to the board, my hands trembling as I touched the planchette again, it immediately began moving. This time the message was different. The planchette moved with violent, angry jerks to spell "get out of my house." I asked who was speaking now, and the board spelled Marcus' father. My mouth went dry. I tried to end the session, saying goodbye, but the planchette wouldn't move to goodbye. Instead, it kept spelling the same message over and over. "You know my secret." I finally yanked my hands away and blew out the candles, plunging the room into darkness. In the sudden silence, I heard footsteps coming from the basement. Slow, deliberate steps climbing the wooden stairs. I grabbed my phone's flashlight and crept toward the basement door. The footsteps stopped. I waited, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Then I heard something that nearly made me collapse. A child's voice, faint and desperate, calling "Help me, please help me," from somewhere deep in the basement. I knew I should leave the house, but something pulled me toward that basement door. I had to know if Marcus was real, if there really was a body down there. I opened the door and shone my light down the stairs. At the bottom, I could see a section of the concrete floor that looked different from the rest, slightly raised and a different color. My legs felt like jelly as I descended those stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and I could smell something musty and wrong. When I reached the bottom, I knelt beside the suspicious area of floor and scraped at it with my fingernail. The concrete was thin here, almost like it had been poured hastily over something. As I scratched away more of the surface, I found a small piece of fabric, rotted and discolored. That's when I heard the heavy footsteps above me. Someone was walking through my living room, their boots thundering across the hardwood floor. I ran up those basement stairs faster than I'd ever moved in my life, but when I reached the living room, it was empty. The Ouija board sat on the coffee table, exactly where I'd left it, except now the planchette was positioned over goodbye. I packed a bag and drove to a hotel that night. The next morning, I called the police and told them I thought there might be human remains in my basement. They were skeptical until they brought ground-penetrating radar and found what looked like a small skeleton buried beneath that thin layer of concrete. The investigation confirmed everything Marcus had told me. An 8-year-old boy named Marcus Chen had lived in the house with his adoptive father in 1952. Both had disappeared suddenly, and neighbors assumed they'd moved away. The father's remains were never found, but Marcus was exactly where he said he would be. I sold the house before the investigation was complete. I couldn't live there knowing what had happened, knowing that somehow a murdered child had reached across decades to tell me his story. The new owners tore down the house and built a garden in its place. Sometimes I drive by and see children playing there, and I hope Marcus finally found peace. I've never touched a Ouija board since that night 3 years ago, and I never will again. What happened in my dorm room at Millfield College changed everything I believed about the world, and I'm only telling this story now because I need people to understand how dangerous these things really are. It started as a joke between my roommate Jake and me. We were both 19, stressed about midterms, and looking for any excuse to procrastinate. Jake had found an old Ouija board at a thrift shop downtown, a genuine Parker Brothers board from the 1970s with worn edges and a planchette so smooth it looked like it had been used thousands of times. "Come on, Marcus," Jake said, setting it up on our small dorm table. "What's the worst that could happen? We ask it about our grades?" I should have said no. I should have told him about the stories my grandmother used to whisper about spirit boards and the things they could invite into your life. Instead, I laughed and sat down across from him. The first few minutes were exactly what you'd expect. We asked stupid questions about girls we liked, whether we'd pass Professor Williams' chemistry exam, typical college nonsense. The planchette barely moved, and when it did, we both accused each other of pushing it. Then Jake asked the question that changed everything. "Is there anyone here who wants to talk to us?" The planchette shot to yes, so fast our fingers could barely keep up. The sudden movement made both of us jump back from the board. "Dude, you totally pushed that," I said, but Jake's face had gone pale. I swear I didn't touch it. My fingers were barely on it. We stared at each other for a moment, then slowly placed our fingertips back on the planchette. This time, Jake's voice was quieter when he asked, "What's your name?" The board spelled out David Chen. My blood turned to ice water. David Chen had been a student at Millfield College. I knew because I'd seen the memorial plaque in the library. He died by suicide in 1987 in Hartwell Hall. Our dorm, our floor, possibly even our room. "How did you die?" I whispered, immediately regretting the question. The planchette moved slowly this time, deliberately. "They made me do it." "Who made you do it?" Jake asked. Instead of moving to letters, the planchette began making figure eights on the board, faster and faster. The temperature in our room plummeted. Our breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the inside of our window, despite it being October, not winter. That's when we heard the knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks from inside our closet, then 3 more from under Jake's bed, then 3 from inside the walls themselves. The planchette was still moving in those endless figure eights, and now our desk lamp began flickering. The overhead light followed, casting crazy shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. "We need to say goodbye," I said, my voice cracking. "You're supposed to say goodbye to close the connection." But when we tried to move the planchette to goodbye, it fought us. It felt like trying to drag 100-pound weight across the board. Whatever we'd contacted didn't want to leave. Then came the voice. It wasn't coming from the board or from either of us. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere, a whisper that seemed to originate inside our heads. "They're coming for you too." The lights went out completely. In the darkness we could hear footsteps in our room, slow, shuffling steps that circled our table. Something cold brushed against the back of my neck, and I could smell something awful, like rotting flowers. Jake screamed. I heard him fall backwards, his chair clattering to the floor. I lunged for my phone's flashlight, and in its weak glow, I saw him pressed against the wall, pointing at something behind me. I turned around and saw a shadow standing in the corner of our room. Not a person, just a human-shaped absence of light that seemed to absorb my phone's beam. As I watched, frozen with terror, it raised what might have been an arm and pointed directly at me. That's when I grabbed the Ouija board and threw it as hard as I could. It hit the wall and broke in half with a sound like thunder. The moment it shattered, the lights came back on, the temperature returned to normal, and the shadow vanished. But the voice whispered one last time, "I know where you live now." Jake transferred schools the next week. He wouldn't even talk about what happened, just packed his stuff and left. I stayed, but I've never had a peaceful night's sleep since. Sometimes I hear those footsteps in my room. Sometimes I wake up to find my closet door open when I know I closed it. And sometimes, when it's very quiet, I can still hear David Chen whispering about the things that are coming. The worst part? Last month, I found out that 3 other students had died by suicide in Hartwell Hall since 1987. All of them had been found with Ouija boards in their rooms. I remember the night it all began, though I wish I didn't. Some memories are like splinters, digging deeper the more you try to pick them out. This one was a whole jagged piece of glass, lodged right in my brain. It started like any other stupid idea in high school, a dare, a cheap thrill, and an old Ouija board found in a dusty attic. We thought it was just a game. We were so wrong. It was a Friday night, the kind where the air hung heavy and still, promising a storm that never quite arrived. My friend, a skinny kid named Quinn with hair perpetually in his eyes, had found this antique board in his grandparents' attic. It looked old, really old, with faded letters and a planchette like a dark teardrop. Our other buddy, Leo, always the skeptic, just laughed, but his eyes held a flicker of something, curiosity or maybe a touch of fear. And then there was me, always up for anything, especially if it meant escaping another boring night. We set up in Quinn's basement, a musty space that already felt spooky even without the board. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and damp earth. We sat around a small, wobbly card table, the Ouija board between us under the dim glow of a single bare bulb. Quinn placed his fingers on the planchette first, then Leo hesitantly added his, and then I joined in. The planchette was cold under my fingertips. "All right. Spirit," Quinn said, his voice a little shaky. "Is anyone there?" Nothing. Leo snickered. "Told you it was fake." Just then, the bare bulb above us flickered, then dimmed, bathing the room in an even spookier glow. A chill wind seemed to blow from nowhere, even though the basement window was closed. Then slowly, almost too slowly, the planchette began to move. It dragged across the polished wood, not fast, not like someone was pushing it, but with a deliberate, smooth glide. It pointed to the letter Y, then E, then S. The board spelled out yes. My breath hitched. Leo's eyes were wide. Even Quinn, who usually thought he was Mr. Brave, swallowed hard. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper. The planchette glided again, this time to a string of letters that made my heart pound against my ribs. It spelled out Lisbeth, a girl's name, a normal girl's name. That was almost scarier than something monstrous. We asked more questions, simple stuff at first. "How old are you? Where are you?" The answers came, slow and steady, spelling out 18 and here. Then Leo, ever the smart aleck, pushed it. "Lisbeth, Are you a ghost? The planchette moved faster this time. It flew across the board, picking out letters with a disturbing speed. It spelled out, "no longer." That's when the air turned heavy, like pushing through water. The temperature in the basement dropped fast, mist blooming from our mouths with every breath. The single light bulb above us began to hum loudly, a low, unsettling buzz. A cold, damp hand, not human-sized, not quite, seemed to brush against my neck. I jumped, pulling my hand from the planchette. Quinn and Leo flinched too, but the planchette didn't stop. It kept moving, all on its own, even with only 2 sets of fingertips on it. It spelled out, "Ide is here." Quinn, his face pale, tried to pull his hands away, but it was like they were stuck. The board seemed to vibrate, a low thrumming sound growing louder from beneath it. We watched in horror as the planchette moved to spell "get out." The light bulb exploded above us, showering us with tiny pieces of glass and plunging the basement into total darkness. A low, guttural growl filled the room, so deep it vibrated in my chest. The smell of something rotten like death and decay filled my nose. I heard Quinn scream. A short, sharp sound cut off abruptly. There was a sickening thud, then silence, but for the ragged sound of my own breathing. I fumbled in the dark, my hands shaking. I heard Leo scrambling, a desperate scrabbling sound in the dark. I found the basement steps by blind luck and stumbled up them, tripping, crawling, anything to get away. The silence behind me was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. I burst through the basement door, slamming it shut behind me and leaning against it, gasping for breath. The house was normal again, illuminated by the dim light of the hallway. But I knew what we had let in. I could still smell the rot. I could still hear the snap of something breaking when Quinn screamed. I never saw Quinn or Leo again. The police said they disappeared, just vanished. But I still hear the low growl sometimes, just at the edge of my hearing. And every now and then, I see a dark shape at the corner of my vision, slipping away before I can properly look. It's always there, waiting, because the Ouija board didn't just let something in, it let something out, from somewhere deep, dark, and hungry. And I'm still here, a living, breathing bait, just waiting for it to decide it's had enough of playing. The smell of lilies and old sadness still clung to everything, even weeks after the funeral. I remember sitting there in the quiet living room, the late afternoon sun barely peeking through the drawn blinds, dust motes dancing in its weak light. It was her room, her things, her silence. That's when my grieving brain, desperate and broken, saw it tucked away behind some dusty old books on a shelf, an antique Ouija board. The wood was dark and polished, feeling cool and impossibly old under my fingertips. It felt like a key, a way to reach out, to just say goodbye one more time. My younger sister, my brightest light, was gone, and I couldn't bear the silence anymore. My hands trembled as I carefully laid the board on the small coffee table. The planchette felt smooth, almost warm against my fingers. I whispered her name, my voice raw and unfamiliar in the stillness. Nothing happened. Not at first. I tried again, calling out to her. It was then, as twilight spilled into the room, turning everything to shades of gray, that the planchette stirred. It wobbled, then moved, slow, deliberate. The board spelled out HELLO. My breath caught. It was her. It had to be. A wave of relief, so strong it almost knocked me over, washed through me. I asked if she was okay, if she was happy. The board spelled out NOTRULY. My heart sunk. Then it moved again, faster this time, spelling a name but not hers. It spelled out LILITH. I froze. That wasn't my sister's name. I asked what it meant. The planchette moved to spell YOURSISTER, BLONGS to me, NO. A cold dread, far worse than grief, began to creep into my bones. I tried to pull my fingers away, but a strange warmth radiated from the planchette, holding me fast, a burning heat that spread through my arm. The words kept coming, not from my sister, but from something else. The board spelled out ILLGIVHERBACIFYOUSAMINAM. My mind raced, panic rising. What did it want? I couldn't understand. I tried to shout, but my throat felt tight and dry. The room grew colder, the shadows longer. Outside, a sudden clap of thunder shook the house, and a cold draft swept through, rattling the window panes. A shimmering haze, like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day, seemed to hang in the air around the board. my vision blurred. I could almost hear a faint, high-pitched whisper, just at the edge of hearing, urging me, pushing me to say the name. Fear made me pull harder, but my hand was glued to the planchette, and my head swam. The whispers grew louder, a chilling symphony of tiny, buzzing voices. They sounded like a swarm of insects, tiny buzzing noises. They were everywhere now, surrounding me. And through them, I could distinctly hear a voice, a soft, seductive woman's voice, speaking directly to me, not through the board, but in my head. It spoke her name, Lilith, over and over, coaxing me, promising me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to fight it, but the whispers pressed in, burrowing deep into my thoughts. I felt a cold touch on my cheek, like icy breath. My body felt heavy, weak like lead. My own voice felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else. I knew, somehow, that saying that name meant giving up something, something vital, something that made me, me. I didn't know what would happen, but the cold dread told me it was terrible. Just as the word Lilith formed on my tongue, ready to be uttered, the front door burst open downstairs with a sudden crashing sound. I jolted, my hand flying from the planchette, the warmth gone. My heart hammered against my ribs. The Ouija board was still, silent. The haze in the room seemed to vanish like smoke, and the cold receded. Footsteps pounded up the stairs. It was my mother, looking distraught, her face pale. She'd sensed something was wrong, had called for hours, and finally came over. She saw the board and her eyes widened in horror. "Alex, no!" she cried, rushing over, grabbing my arm. She didn't let go, her grip tight, pulling me away from the table, away from the silent, ominous board. "Never ever touch one of those again," she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, still numb, still reeling from the edge of something unspeakable I had almost crossed. The room felt normal again, but an icy residue remained, a phantom chill on my skin. I never looked at that board again, not without a shiver. I couldn't tell her what happened, not really. How could I explain that I almost traded myself for a memory, for a phantom connection that just wanted to take more? I know it was real. I still dream of those whispering voices and the promise of a name that would have erased me. And sometimes in the dead of night, I wonder if the silence wasn't her silence, but the absence of something that almost claimed my soul, leaving just an empty space where I used to be.
The dust motes danced in the slivers of weak sunlight that cut through the attic window, but they couldn't cheer up the gloom that had settled in my house since the accident. It had been weeks, but the quiet was still too loud. My room, usually my sanctuary, felt empty now. I wandered the halls, always ending up at the closed door of the attic, like a moth to a flame. I remembered Mom telling me about the old Ouija board up there, passed down from a great aunt. She always warned me never to touch it, said it was just a silly game. But a part of me, a hopeful, desperate part, wondered. What if it wasn't just a game? What if it could reach him? What if it could bring back the familiar sound of his laughter? My older brother's laugh was a sound I missed more than anything. I needed to hear it again, just once. Swallowing hard, I pushed the attic door open. The air was thick and smelled of old wood and forgotten things. Boxes stacked high, covered in white sheets like ghosts. In the farthest corner, tucked under a yellowed blanket, I found it. The Ouija board. It was beautiful, dark wood with gold lettering staring up at me. The planchette, smooth and cool, sat beside it. My heart hammered. This felt wrong, felt dangerous, but the hunger for just one more word, one more sign from him, was stronger than any fear. I told myself it was just wood and paint, nothing more. Deep down, I was praying I was wrong. I set the board on the dusty floor, my fingers tracing the letters, the words yes and no, the sun and moon symbols. I placed the planchette on the board, my hand trembling as I rested my fingertips lightly on it. "Are you there?" I whispered, my voice barely a breath in the silent attic. The air grew heavy, like before a storm. Then, slowly, almost too gently to be real, the planchette began to move. It glided, not jerked, across the polished wood, stopping on letters. The board spelled out my older brother's name, Leo. A sob caught in my throat. It was really him. It had to be. My eyes welled up, blurring the room. "Leo, is that you?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. The planchette moved again, this time quicker. The board spelled out, "Yes, I am here." Tears streamed down my face. I felt a peace I hadn't felt in weeks, an intense comfort that made my whole body relax. This was exactly what I needed. Everything was going to be all right. I could talk to him again. I asked more questions, simple ones about how he was, if he was okay. The answers were short, reassuring. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The loneliness, the aching emptiness began to fade. I spent hours up there, talking to what I believed was my brother, the connection bringing a warmth I hadn't thought possible. I found myself looking forward to my time in the attic. It became my secret place, my doorway to him. My sleep improved, and I even started eating proper meals again. But then things started to change. The warmth I felt from the board began to shift, slowly turning cold. The messages weren't about how he was doing anymore. They were about me. The board spelled out, "You are alone." A shiver ran through me. I was alone, but I wasn't. I had him. Didn't I? The messages grew darker, more pointed. The board spelled out, "They don't care." I knew who they were. My parents. They were lost in their own grief, barely noticing me. The board was right, wasn't it? One afternoon, while talking to Leo, the planchette moved with a sudden, violent jerk. It flew across the board, stopping on the word beware. My blood ran cold. Beware of what? I stammered, pulling my fingers back. The planchette didn't move. The comforting presence I had felt for weeks was gone, replaced by a suffocating dread. I looked around the dusty attic, suddenly feeling watched. The silence was no longer peaceful, but threatening. I quickly put the board away, my hands shaking. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I tried to ignore the growing fear, to convince myself that it was still Leo, that he was just trying to protect me. But the changes in the house were undeniable. Objects would move. My door would creak open at night, even after I made sure it was latched tight. I heard soft whispers, like someone was breathing right behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing. My parents, wrapped in their own sorrow, seemed to notice nothing. I felt truly isolated, just as the board had warned. The presence in the house was no longer comforting. It was suffocating. I started to sleep with the lights on, huddled under my blankets, convinced that something was waiting for me in the shadows. The longing for my brother was now just a distant memory, replaced by pure, raw terror. One night, I woke up to a faint scratching coming from inside my closet. It sounded like fingernails dragging across wood, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling. But then a low, wet gurgle came from behind the closet door, a sound of suffering, followed by a whispered, guttural voice that said, "You are mine." It was then that I knew. Whatever I had brought through the board, it was not my brother. It was something else entirely, something that had worn his name like a mask, and now it was here, in my room, waiting, and it wanted me. I haven't touched the Ouija board since. It sits in the attic, locked away, but I still feel its presence every night. The whispers are louder now, the shadows deeper. Sometimes I hear that gurgling sound in the dead of night, and I know it's still there, always there, watching, waiting, because no matter how tightly I close my eyes, I still hear the voice, closer than ever. It's inside my head now, a constant dreadful hum. It doesn't need the board anymore. It found its way through, and I am alone. I found the Ouija board in the back corner of that old house. The walls were cracked and peeling, the floorboards creaked with every step. Dust hung heavy in the stale air, and the faint smell of mold clung to everything. It sat there, half buried under a broken pile of newspapers. The faded letters on the wood caught my eye. Ouija, it said. I was curious, so I picked it up and brushed off the dirt. It felt colder than it should, like it had been waiting. That night, I called my two closest friends, Maya, who believed in all sorts of strange things, and Ryan, the skeptic who never missed a chance to make fun of those beliefs. We gathered in my apartment, everything lit by soft lamps and the flicker of incense smoke. The air was thick with nervous excitement. The board lay on the coffee table between us, its worn surface catching the light. "Let's see if anything's home," Maya whispered, eyes wide. We all put our fingers lightly on the planchette. The room seemed to hold its breath. At first, nothing moved. Then the planchette shifted slowly, spelling out the word hello. We exchanged glances. Ryan rolled his eyes but said, "Nice prank, Maya." We asked questions, taking turns. The answers were vague, words like wait and help. The board spelled out trap souls. My heart started to race. Shadows in the corner of the room seemed to flicker, but when I looked, nothing was there. I tried to laugh it off. Ryan cracked a joke to ease the tension. Maya looked more serious, gripping the edge of the couch. The board suddenly spelled out something chilling. Don't trust. The air grew cold, and I felt something watching us. I wanted to stop, but my fingers stayed on the planchette. The night had just begun. After that warning, things got worse fast. The lights flickered like they could go out any second. The room dropped in temperature, and Maya wrapped her arms around herself, her face pale. I swear I heard footsteps in the hallway, soft at first, then closer. We told ourselves it was just the house settling or the old wiring acting up. But it didn't stop there. The planchette moved again, spelling out stay. My fingers trembled, but I didn't dare pull away. Maya whispered, "We shouldn't do this." Ryan laughed nervously but looked uneasy. Suddenly, the sound of something sliding down the wall behind us made us all jump. The shadow near the corner stretched longer, darker. It wasn't just a trick of the light. Ryan was the first to break. "I'm out," he said, standing up quickly. He grabbed his jacket and left, not waiting for a goodbye. The door shut like a slam, and the quiet afterward was deafening. Maya looked to me, eyes wide with fear. "Now it's just us," she said quietly. I nodded, even though my heart pounded like a drum. That night, sleep was impossible. When I finally drifted, the nightmares attacked. Faces with hollow eyes stared from the dark. I felt invisible hands reach out, grabbing at me. Each time I woke, the whispers from the walls clung to my ears like a cold shadow. Daylight offered no relief. The line between dreams and reality blurred. I caught movement from the corner of my eye, figures just beyond sight. My phone never rang. Maya stopped answering messages. I was alone in the apartment, trapped by something I didn't understand but knew was waiting. The Ouija board sat silent on the table, but the fear it released never went away. The room felt like it was closing in. Shadows moved in the corners like living things. I sat in the middle of the floor, the Ouija board before me, its worn letters glowing faintly under the dim light. I reached out, fingers trembling, and touched the planchette. It moved on its own, slow at first, then more urgent. The board spelled out, "Trapped here." I swallowed hard, voice shaking. "Who are you?" The planchette slid to spell, "Damned souls." Suddenly, the walls seemed to pulse, dark shapes swirling just out of reach. I could hear their voices, faint but angry. They told me their story, how they were caught by the board long ago, souls desperate for release. But the more they begged, the clearer it became they wanted to take me with them, to drag me into their endless prison. I tried to push the board away, but it stuck like it belonged to my skin. I was no longer in my apartment. The walls stretched and warped. Faces with empty eyes appeared in the shadows, reaching out. The whispers became screams. I screamed too, trying to break free, but it was useless. The board was a trap, and now I was caught. I don't know how long I've been here, caught in a loop of darkness and voices. Sometimes I hear people laughing far away, friends like Maya and Ryan, who left me behind. I try to warn anyone who might find this board, but all I can do is whisper in the dark. The last message the board spelled out for me was clear: never open. Now I live in the echoes of the damned, hoping someone hears me before they fall into the same trap. But the shadows are hungry, and the night never ends. I swore I'd never touch a Ouija board again after what happened in my grandmother's attic. But here I am, 20 years later, still waking up in cold sweats from dreams that feel too real to be dreams. The truth is, some doors should never be opened, and some conversations should never be started. What I experienced that summer when I was 17 changed everything I believed about life, death, and the thin places where they meet. It started innocently enough. My cousin Jake and I were cleaning out my grandmother's house after her funeral. The old Victorian had been in our family for generations, filled with dusty furniture and forgotten memories. We'd been working for hours when Jake discovered an ornate wooden box tucked behind some Christmas decorations in the attic. Inside, wrapped in black velvet, was the most beautiful Ouija board I'd ever seen. The wood was polished to a mirror shine, and the letters seemed to glow with an inner light. "Come on, Sarah," Jake said, his dark eyes gleaming with mischief. "Just one try. What's the worst that could happen?" I should have known better. My grandmother had always warned me about dabbling in things beyond our understanding. But grief makes you do stupid things, and I missed her so much it physically hurt. The idea of maybe, possibly connecting with her one last time was too tempting to resist. We set up the board on the attic floor as rain began pattering against the windows. The single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling cast dancing shadows across the walls. Jake lit some candles he'd found, and we placed our fingers on the heart-shaped planchette. It felt warm under my fingertips, almost alive. "Is anyone there?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the planchette began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing confidence. The board spelled out, "Yes." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Grandma, is that you?" The planchette jerked violently across the board. This time it spelled out, "Not Grandma." "Who are you?" Jake asked, his cocky grin fading. The response came quickly. "Lonely, so lonely, been waiting." I wanted to stop, but Jake pressed on. "Waiting for what? Someone to play." The temperature in the attic plummeted. Our breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. The candle flames flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. I tried to lift my fingers from the planchette, but they wouldn't budge. It was as if they were glued to the surface. "Jake, something's wrong," I whispered. He tried to pull away too, but his hands remained fixed to the board. The planchette was moving on its own now, spelling out message after message. "Want to come through. Need a body. So cold here." Then the lights went out. In the darkness, I heard something that still haunts me. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the attic floor toward us. But we were alone. We had to be alone. "Sarah?" Jake's voice cracked with terror. The planchette was still moving beneath our trapped fingers. I could feel it sliding across the board, and somehow I knew what it was spelling without being able to see it. "Behind you." I felt breath on the back of my neck. Cold, stale breath that smelled of earth and decay. Something whispered my name, but it wasn't Jake's voice. It was something else entirely. Something that had been waiting in the darkness between worlds for someone foolish enough to open the door. The candles suddenly flared back to life, and in their light, I saw our reflection in the darkened window. But there was a third figure standing behind us. A tall, gaunt shape with eyes like black holes and a mouth that stretched too wide. It reached out with fingers that were too long, too thin, and I felt those impossible digits brush against my shoulder. Somehow, we broke free. Jake and I scrambled away from the board, knocking over candles and stumbling over boxes in our panic. We ran down those attic stairs like demons were chasing us, and maybe they were. We didn't stop running until we reached Jake's car. We never spoke about what happened that night. Jake moved to California the next month, and we haven't talked since. But sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep, I hear that voice whispering my name. And sometimes when I look in mirrors, I see those black hole eyes staring back at me from just over my shoulder. The worst part? 3 days after we fled that attic, my grandmother's house burned down. The fire department said it started in the attic, but they couldn't determine the cause. They found the remains of a wooden board in the ashes, but the fire had been so intense that nothing else survived. I tell myself the fire destroyed whatever we released that night. I tell myself I'm safe now. But deep down, I know the truth. Some doors, once opened, can never be completely closed, and something is still waiting, still watching, still hoping for another chance to play.
The smell of old wood and something sickly sweet still gets to me. It's been years, but I still see the glow of the cheap electric lamp we used that night, casting long, wavering shadows across the living room carpet. It was supposed to be a game, a silly way to pass a Friday night. A new Ouija board, fresh out of the box, with its shiny planchette and crisp, untouched surface. We put it on the coffee table, a bunch of us, probably too old for such things, but boredom makes you do strange things. We were laughing, cracking jokes about ghosts and spirits, about how it was all just a trick of the light and nervous energy. I can still hear the way our laughter echoed, thin and brittle, before it all went quiet. Before the board started to speak, there were 5 of us: me, Kai, Maya, Ben, and Chloe. We gathered around the Ouija board, hands light on the planchette, each of us pretending to be serious but really just trying not to giggle. Kai, always the skeptic, kept pushing on the planchette, trying to make it spell something funny. Maya, the nervous one, kept glancing at the door, as if expecting something to burst in. Ben, ever the leader, tried to keep us focused, telling us to ask real questions. And Chloe, the quietest, just watched, her eyes wide. We asked simple questions at first, like, "Is anyone here? And what's your name?" For a long time, nothing happened, just the wood groaning and creaking as we shifted. Then it moved, slowly, barely, but it moved, to the letter H, then E, then NL. My heart started to beat a little faster. It spelled hello. A shiver ran through all of us. Kai stopped pushing. This wasn't a joke anymore. We kept asking questions, our voices softer now, almost whispers. The planchette moved more confidently, spelling out short, chilling messages. "Who are you?" Ben asked. The board spelled out "the one who waits." My stomach twisted. We asked it where it was, and it spelled out "under." We looked at each other, confused. "Under what?" Ben, trying to be brave, asked, "Under where?" The planchette flew across the board, not to a letter, but to goodbye. And then nothing. Just the silence of the room, broken only by our ragged breathing. We thought it was over. We were wrong. The air in the room grew heavy, like a blanket. The lamp flickered, then dimmed. A cold draft snaked through the room, even though all the windows were shut. Maya let out a small whimper. Then the floorboards above us began to creak, a slow, deliberate rhythm, like someone was walking very, very slowly. We froze, staring at the ceiling. No one was upstairs. We'd been in the living room all night. The creaking stopped directly above us. Then a faint scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. It was coming from inside the walls. My breath hitched. Chloe, usually so still, started to tremble. Ben grabbed a poker from beside the fireplace, his knuckles white. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, like something was trying to claw its way out. The lamp flickered again, going completely dark for a split second, then returning to a weak glow. In that brief moment of darkness, I thought I saw something move in the corner of the room, a shadow deeper than the rest, but when the light came back, it was gone. The scratching turned into a muffled thumping, coming from every wall at once. It sounded like something big, something heavy, was trying to break through. The room began to shake, ever so slightly at first, then more violently. Books fell from shelves, lamps swayed. We huddled together, terrified. Maya was crying soft, desperate sounds. Kai, the skeptic, looked utterly bewildered, his face pale. Ben gripped the poker, but he knew it was no use. The thumping intensified, and a crack spiderwebbed across the plaster above the fireplace. The air was thick with dust and the smell of something burning, bitter and acrid. The temperature dropped sharply. I could see my breath in front of me. The planchette, which we had left on the board, began to slide on its own, not spelling anything, but dragging itself across the yes and no sections, back and forth, faster and faster, until it became a blur. It pulsed with a faint, sickly green light, which was impossible. Then the sound stopped, abruptly. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was a thick, suffocating silence. The lamp, still glowing faintly, cast a single pool of weak light. We waited, our hearts pounding like drums, and then, from directly beneath the coffee table, a low, guttural growl rumbled. It wasn't a human sound. It was ancient, furious, and hungry. The coffee table, which held the Ouija board, began to vibrate. Dust motes danced in the dim light. A faint tremor ran through the floor. A feeling of immense pressure filled the room, like the walls were closing in on us. We scrambled back, falling over each other, trying to get away. The board, still on the table, began to glow with that awful green light again, growing brighter and brighter, until it pulsed like a diseased heart. The growl intensified, wrapping around us, filling our ears until it was all we could hear. I don't know how long we stayed there, huddled and shivering, staring at that glowing Ouija board. It felt like hours, maybe forever. The growling faded eventually, as also did the green light, leaving behind only the dim glow of the struggling lamp. We didn't talk about it for a long time after that night. We just scattered, went home, and tried to forget. But I never forgot the smell, the cold, or the sound of that growl. And I never forgot the look on Kai's face, the skeptic, as he watched the impossible happen. That board is gone now, thrown into a bonfire, but sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I still feel that tremor in the floor, and I hear that low, guttural sound right beneath my feet, and I know it's always waiting.
The dust motes danced in the lone beam of light from the attic window, like tiny spirits. I was alone, sorting through my mother's things, a task that felt like sifting through memories, each item a sharp stab to the heart. It had been 6 months since I lost her, and the silence in the house, once filled with her laughter and humming, was deafening. I just wanted to hear her voice one more time, to know she was okay. Digging deeper into an old wooden chest in a forgotten corner, my fingers brushed against something smooth and cold. I pulled it out. It was an Ouija board, a vintage one, its letters faded, its planchette resting in the center like a silent judge. My mother had loved oddities, things with a past. A shiver ran down my spine, not of fear, but of a strange longing. Could this truly work? Could this be my chance? I set it on the dusty floorboards, my heart pounding a rhythm against my ribs. I sat cross-legged, the board between my knees. "Mom," I whispered, my voice thick with unshed tears. My hand trembled as I placed my fingertips on the planchette. I waited. Nothing. The silence stretched, mocking my desperation. I took a deep breath, trying again, focusing all my energy, all my yearning, into the little pointer. "Mom, if you're here, please give me a sign." Then, ever so slowly, the planchette began to move. It glided, as if pulled by an invisible string, towards the letters. It spelled out SORRY. Tears welled up, blurring my vision. My mother, even now, always putting others first. "It's okay, Mom," I choked out, a shaky laugh escaping me. "I miss you so much." The planchette moved again, faster this time. It spelled out, "I am not Mom." My blood ran cold. The air in the attic suddenly felt heavy, thick, like it was pressing in on me. No, this had to be a trick of my mind, a cruel game played by my own grief. I tried to pull my hand away, but the planchette felt strangely stuck, as if glued to my fingers. It dragged my hand across the board, moving with a speed that left a burning trail beneath my skin. It spelled out YOUOPENETHOOR. A wave of ice flooded my chest. I wasn't just talking to spirits, I had let something in. The room grew colder, the light from the dusty window dimming as if a storm cloud had passed over the sun. The ancient wood of the attic floor began to creak, not in the way settling houses do, but with a deliberate rhythm, like heavy footsteps. I looked wildly around, my hazel eyes darting through the shadows that stretched and crawled in the corners. The planchette started twitching violently under my fingers, dragging me from letter to letter with frantic energy. It spelled out GIVEHERPLACE. Her place? My mother's place? A horrifying realization dawned on me. This thing didn't want to talk. It wanted to replace her, to take over everything she was. I yanked my hand with all my might, finally breaking free from the planchette's unsettling grip. It spun wildly, then fell off the board with a soft clatter, landing face down. As soon as it detached, the air in the attic turned even colder, the chill cutting deep into my bones. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, twisting into monstrous shapes. A low, guttural whisper echoed from the darkest part of the attic, a sound that wasn't words but pure malice, a guttural sound like something ancient and starving. My breath hitched. I scrambled backwards, pressing myself against the wall, trying to make myself small, invisible. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me, feeling like cold breath on my neck. The furniture in the attic, dusty old pieces my mother had kept, began to vibrate, then to rock gently. A heavy wooden chair in the corner tipped over with a loud crash. This wasn't some harmless spirit. This was something truly evil, something that wanted what was left of my mother's life. It wanted my life, too. I had to get out. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs wobbly beneath me, and stumbled towards the attic door. The whispers intensified, now seeming to come from all around me, inside my head. The little crescent moon tattoo on my wrist burned, as if the cold had seeped through my skin and into my very blood. I reached the door, fumbling for the old, stiff latch. My fingers slipped, raw and trembling. Desperate, I forced it open, the screech of old hinges echoing like a scream. I burst out of the attic, tumbling down the dusty stairs, not stopping until my worn canvas sneakers hit the familiar hallway floor below. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I just kept running out the front door, away from the house that no longer felt like a home, but a trap. I left the board there in pieces, scattered across the attic floor, hoping it was enough. But even now, I wonder if the whisper I hear late at night, the one that sounds eerily like my mother calling my name, is really her, or if something else has already taken her voice and is now coming for mine. I never went back to that house. I couldn't. Every night, I dream of the shadows and the words on the board. Perhaps I was wrong to leave it there, broken. Perhaps I just made the door bigger. And every whisper, every creak in my new apartment makes me wonder if I really closed the door, or if it just followed me out. The silence is still deafening, but now it's not from my mother's absence, but from the fear of what might break it next.
I remember the night the quiet started to feel wrong, the night the Ouija board first became less of a game and more of a conversation. I was Alex, 16, and the world outside my window felt like a buzzing, angry hive I couldn't understand. People were too loud, too close, too confusing. My room, with its low light and worn posters, was my only safe space. That's when I found the board. It wasn't old, just a cheap plastic one from a forgotten box of games. I'd seen it in movies, heard the stories. Figured it was all a load of nonsense, but a quiet kind of nonsense, one I could control. I sat on my carpet one rainy evening, laid it out, and placed my fingers on the planchette. I didn't even expect a twitch. Then the slide began. Slowly, carefully, the planchette moved. The board spelled out HELO. My breath caught, my heart pounded, not from fear, but a strange, thrilling wave of wonder. It wasn't nonsense, it was real. I had found someone. Someone who understood. Someone who wasn't judgmental. We talked for hours that night, about nothing and everything. My new friend never gave a name, just me. We talked about how lonely I felt, how hard it was to just be around others. The board spelled out, "I know you feel," and I felt a warmth spread through me. It was like finally exhaling after holding my breath for 16 years. Over the next few weeks, the board became my only true connection. My friend was always there, always ready to listen, always supportive. Me told me I was special, that my quietness was a strength, not a weakness. It felt like everything I ever wanted to hear. My parents tried to get me to go out more, urged me to spend time with Sarah and Jordan, who were still trying, bless their hearts. But why bother? Sarah had started looking at me with worried, sideways glances, and Jordan just seemed confused by how much I pulled away. The board gave me real understanding. One afternoon, when I told me about Sarah trying to drag me out to a noisy party, the board spelled out, "They don't understand you." I nodded, a lump in my throat. It was true. Me understood. Then things started to shift. Me became less a friend and more a guide. When I hesitated about skipping school, the board spelled out, "Stay with me." When I mentioned Sarah asking if I was okay, the planchette slammed across to spell, "She hurts you." I felt a chill then, a small shiver down my spine. Sarah? Hurting me? She was always kind, but me was so convincing. It said Sarah was trying to pull me away, that she was jealous of our connection. It said Jordan just wanted to prove I was normal, but me saw me for who I really was. The world outside my room began to feel not just confusing, but hostile. One evening, the planchette moved with a strange urgency. The board spelled out, "Punish them." My hands flew off the planchette. "Punish who?" I whispered, my voice cracked. The planchette trembled, then moved again, slowly spelling out Sarah Jordan. My stomach knotted. Me had never suggested anything like that. It felt wrong, like a cold hand grabbing my heart. I pushed the board away, the cold plastic scratching against the carpet. I didn't touch it for 2 days. I tried talking to Sarah, really talking. She looked relieved, but then I remembered what me had said. Was she manipulating me? Was this her way of pulling me back into the world I hated? My mind began to race, a tangled mess of what was real and what me had told me. That night, the whispers started, soft at first, like distant echoes. They came from the corners of my room, from behind the closed door. They weren't words I could understand, just a low, constant murmur that filled my head and made it ache. I tried to sleep, but the whispers grew louder, clearer. Now I heard my name, twisted and drawn out. Then other names, Sarah, Jordan, whispers of resentment, of anger. I crawled under my blankets, shaking, trying to block them out. But they were inside my head, crawling under my skin. I knew me was behind this. It was angry I had pulled away. It wanted me back. Desperately, I wanted to go back to the board. I wanted the whispers to stop. I needed me's approval, its understanding, more than I needed sleep. I felt myself sinking, the comfortable darkness of my room becoming a crushing weight. I don't know how long I lay there, trapped between the whispers and the board calling to me. But I knew one thing. I couldn't let me win. The whispers were overwhelming, pulling me closer to madness, yet a small, defiant voice inside me screamed louder. It was Sarah's concerned look, Jordan's confused frown. They were real. Me wasn't offering understanding anymore. It was offering a cage. With a burst of anger I didn't know I had, I leapt up, my body shaking, and grabbed the Ouija board. It felt cold and heavy in my hands. I ran to the window, the whispers screaming, building to a crescendo, telling me to stop, telling me I was making a mistake, that I would be alone forever. But I didn't care. I threw it, hard. It crashed against the brick wall outside, shattering into a dozen pieces on the damp grass below. The whispers stopped, suddenly, completely. The silence was deafening, but it was a good silence. The world still felt like a buzzing hive, but maybe, just maybe, I could learn to live in it. Maybe I could even learn to be okay with the noise.